Have you ever imagined that a simple, silent encounter could completely change your life? Alyssa hadn't either. That cloudy morning, all she wanted was a quiet moment on the park bench before another busy day at the hospital. But fate had other plans. It placed beside her a mysterious man with empty eyes who had just run away from his own wedding. She could have simply stood up and walked away, but instead, she chose to stay. Little did she know that this small decision would change not only her story, but the lives of an entire town. And you? Have you ever stopped to think about the power of small gestures? It's amazing how, so often, what happens in the silent in-between moments of life is exactly what we need to heal. This is a story about courage, about staying when it's easier to leave, and about learning that love isn't about grand promises. It's about the daily decision to remain. In this video, you'll follow a real, raw, and deeply emotional journey. You'll witness how two strangers found, in silence, something no words could ever give: truth, acceptance, and a love so genuine it didn't need to prove its strength. Stay until the end, because I promise you, the ending of this story will touch your heart in the most unexpected way. But before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Rate this story from 0 to 5, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Every week, we bring you stories like this, stories made for those who believe in the power of true love. Now, take a deep breath, get comfortable, and allow yourself to live this story, because it begins right now. The morning was overcast, the air slightly chilly, as if the world itself had paused to reflect. In the main square of the small town of Willow Spring, a woman with a steady gaze and her hair tied back sat on a worn wooden bench. Alyssa had the habit of stopping there every morning before work, a moment just for herself, far from pressure, bills, and difficult decisions. In her backpack, she carried the simple snacks she prepared to sell at the hospital, where she worked as a nursing assistant. But that morning, the bench wasn't empty. Beside her, a man in a wrinkled suit and a loose tie stared at the ground, as if he had lost something far greater than words could ever describe. She hesitated for a second before sitting, but there was something about that silence that felt familiar, like an echo of what she herself carried. He didn't look at her, not even when Alyssa crossed her legs or opened the thermos with the coffee she always brought. His expression held a mix of exhaustion, pain, and a kind of restrained guilt. She noticed the faint tan line where a wedding ring had recently been removed from his ring finger, and she discreetly saw a small tear near the seam of his white shirt, as if he had left in a rush. For a moment, she thought about saying something, but chose to respect the silence. Sometimes, presence is more powerful than any question. Alyssa bit into a piece of her jelly sandwich and offered him the other half. "Want some?" she asked simply, without looking directly at him. The man slowly turned his head, as if realizing, for the first time, that he wasn't alone. His eyes were a deep, intense blue, but something inside them was broken. "I don't usually accept food from strangers," he replied in a low, hoarse voice. She gave a half smile. "Then it's your lucky day. I'm the most trustworthy stranger in this town." He accepted the piece of bread, perhaps more for the gesture than out of hunger. "Do you always sit here?" he asked after a long sip of the coffee she offered him next. "Every day? It's my peace before the chaos begins." He nodded. "Peace? That's rare." Alyssa looked down at his expensive leather shoes, now stained with dirt, as if he had wandered through fields and back roads aimlessly. "Rough morning?" she risked asking, not out of curiosity, but genuine empathy. He hesitated. "Running away from your own wedding probably qualifies as a rough morning." Alyssa almost choked on her coffee. She looked at him sideways, surprised, but didn't judge. "There must be a good reason for that. Or a lot of bad ones," he replied, staring at his hands. She waited for him to continue, but the silence returned, thick and almost reverent. Sometimes, the altar feels more like a sentence than a choice. Alyssa understood that more than she cared to admit. Not all bonds are love. Some are shackles. "Are you going back?" she asked, watching the pigeons flutter around the nearby fountain. "I don't know," he said, "but for the first time in a long while, I let myself stop." Alyssa leaned back on the bench, letting the soft breeze stir a few loose strands of her hair. The stranger beside her carried a heavy presence. Yet, there was something real about him. Someone on the verge of collapse, or perhaps a new beginning. "My name is Alyssa," she finally said. He looked at her with tired eyes. And mine is Nathan. Nathan. The name echoed in Alyssa's mind like more than just a name. She didn't know it yet, but that man sitting beside her carried a story that would turn her own upside down. Alyssa wasn't looking for romance. Neither was he. But there, between pigeons and hurried footsteps in a town moving unaware, something had been planted. Maybe a seed of empathy. Maybe the whisper of fate. After a few minutes, he stood, adjusting his wrinkled suit. "Thank you for the coffee. And for not asking too much." Alyssa simply nodded with a soft smile. Sometimes, all we need is a bench and someone who knows how to be quiet with us. Nathan looked at her a moment longer, as if wanting to say something but lacking the courage. Then, he walked away slowly, with no clear direction, disappearing down the street that led to the town's old hotel. She watched until he vanished from view. And in that moment, without knowing why, she felt that encounter wasn't random. It was the beginning of something, even if neither of them knew what. Yet, Alyssa remained on the bench, holding her mug with both hands, as if still warming her fingers and her thoughts. There was something about that man that didn't match the image of a runaway groom, or of anyone ordinary. His posture was elegant even in disarray, his gestures restrained, his words carefully chosen, as if trained never to reveal too much. She didn't know if he was a lawyer, a doctor, or an executive, but one thing was certain. He carried far too much weight for someone who should have been celebrating love. Time passed quicker than usual, and Alyssa only stood when the tower clock struck 9. She packed the remains of her lunch, adjusted her worn denim jacket over her shoulders, and silently said goodbye to the bench, now no longer anonymous. That day, her simple routine no longer felt so ordinary. On her way to the hospital, his words echoed, "Running away from your own wedding." It was the kind of phrase that might sound dramatic, if it hadn't been spoken with such quiet truth. Alyssa knew people who pretended to be fine just to please the world. She herself had done it for years, until she decided that peace mattered more than appearances. Maybe that's why she didn't judge him. Because deep down, she recognized the pain of someone who chose to survive, even if it meant disappointing expectations. And that was courage, even if no one else understood. When she arrived at the hospital, the sound of monitors, hurried footsteps, and voices in the hallways pulled her back into the day's rhythm. She greeted co-workers, changed into her scrubs, and tied her hair up with a pencil, as she always did. But her gaze, in distracted moments, wandered back to the park bench and the man with the broken eyes. Nathan. She repeated the name to herself, as if trying to memorize something important before time could erase it. She didn't know if she'd ever see him again. Maybe it was just a fleeting encounter, like so many that cross our paths and vanish like smoke. But something inside her refused to believe that. During her lunch break, as she warmed her meal in the cafeteria, Alyssa saw something that made her heart race. On the wall-mounted TV, a reporter stood live in front of a luxury hotel in New York. Sources confirmed that the heir to the Lancaster Group, one of the country's largest conglomerates, abandoned the altar just minutes before the ceremony. The image of a man in a wrinkled suit and lost expression filled the screen. She stopped chewing. Nathan. His full name appeared in bold letters, Nathaniel Lancaster III. Alyssa took a step back. Her fork fell into the plate. She tried to process it, but it was like the world had hit pause. Nathaniel Lancaster. The name sounded like something from a business magazine, not a quiet morning conversation over coffee and bread. And she had shared her snack with him, had offered him silence. Her heart raced, not from fear, but something stranger, intuition. That man she'd met, with hollow eyes and a quiet voice, wasn't just a runaway groom. He was a man carrying a story, far too big to stay hidden for long. She turned off the television. She didn't want to hear more. The world would now know who he was, what he did, and why, or at least what the media twisted into truth. But Alyssa, knowing almost nothing about him, had already seen what truly mattered. Not the last name, not the scandal, but the raw pain of someone who walked away from a role to stay true to himself. And that, in her eyes, was worth more than any fortune, more than a family name or a headline. It was worth humanity. That night, as she washed dishes with hands wrinkled from hot water, Alyssa reflected on how strange life could be. How we sometimes connect with someone we'll never see again, and other times meet someone we were never expecting to. She didn't know if she'd ever see him again. But something deep inside told her that story hadn't ended on that park bench. She believed fate had quiet ways of stitching together encounters that change everything. And maybe, just maybe, Nathan's silence had been the first thread in a new tapestry, one that was just beginning to form. And somehow, she was already part of it without realizing. A breeze came through the slightly open windows of her small apartment, carrying the scent of coming rain. Alyssa sat at the edge of her bed, a towel over her shoulders, damp hair dripping onto her old pajamas. On the nightstand sat the little note she wrote every evening, one line of gratitude, one of hope. But tonight, she didn't know what to write. Words felt too small to contain everything she had felt since that improbable meeting. She simply wrote, "Sometimes the universe sits beside us and says nothing, and let life write the rest." In a modest hotel room on the other side of town, Nathan stared at the ceiling. His suit was tossed over a chair, his shirt unbuttoned, revealing pale, weary skin. He had turned off his phone. The calls, the messages, the headlines. Too much noise for someone who just wanted to breathe. But the memory of her, the woman who smelled of coffee and had steady eyes, remained. She hadn't treated him like a celebrity in crisis. She didn't demand answers. She just sat, shared her bread, and stayed. And for someone like Nathan, that was rarer than love. He wondered if she had recognized him, if she knew who he was, or if she had simply chosen to see the man, not the name. But something in her expression, in the way she never tried to intrude on his silence, made him believe she hadn't. And that made it all the more real. For the first time in a long time, he felt seen, not as an heir, a CEO, or a magazine cover, but as a human being in pieces. And that scared him more than anything. How someone so ordinary had touched a part of him no one else ever had. Maybe it was just exhaustion or the weight of the day, but something in him knew. That woman wasn't passing through in the quiet midnight of Willow Spring. Two vastly different worlds were now linked by a moment too small for its consequences. Two strangers who had shared the same bench, the same bread, and perhaps, unknowingly, the same emptiness. The town slept unaware that a story had begun, quietly, without music or promises. But like all great stories, it didn't need applause. In its first act, only silence. And in that silence, something had already started to bloom. Something neither of them dared call destiny. Yet, deep in their hearts, Alyssa and Nathan fell asleep that night with the strange sense that something had shifted. Nothing had been said with grand gestures or romantic lines. But what was blooming was rarer: recognition, presence, listening. And in real life, true love often begins that way: quiet, simple, and unexpected. Tomorrow, the world would keep turning, the headlines would go on, the routines would resume. But they somehow had already left marks on each other, and fate was only beginning to write. The sun hadn't fully risen when Alyssa crossed the street toward the bakery. In the window, the usual golden loaves looked less inviting against the restlessness in her chest. She tried to act as if nothing had happened, as if yesterday's encounter hadn't silently shifted the course of her routine. But something within her, somewhere between her heart and her stomach, pulsed differently. The image of Nathan, or rather, Nathaniel Lancaster, filled her thoughts like a melody she couldn't forget. She had heard that last name before, of course, on the news, in magazines, on headlines about corporations and gala events. Never did she imagine that one day he would appear in front of her with vacant eyes and a wrinkled suit. She tried to convince herself it was just coincidence, that the meeting had ended right there on the park bench. Even so, her eyes scanned every unfamiliar face on the street with cautious attention, as if looking for something without admitting it. Her backpack felt heavier, perhaps from fatigue, or from a confusion she didn't want to name. Alyssa's mind, always restless, insisted on revisiting every detail of that brief but loaded exchange. At the hospital cafe, her coworkers eagerly gossiped about the scandal. "Did you see? The billionaire groom who disappeared before saying 'I do.' That'll be the talk for weeks." Alyssa only smiled discreetly, keeping everything to herself. Sitting at her desk, she was writing out the medication schedule when her palm began to sweat slightly. The image on one of the nurses' phones hit her like a punch. Nathan in close-up, being escorted by security through what looked like an emergency exit. His expression was different, not the man she saw at the park, but someone cornered, pressured, by eyes demanding answers. The hallway buzz grew louder, nurses whispering, patients speculating, and the name, Lancaster, became impossible to ignore. Still, she kept working with her usual focus, even as her heart skipped erratically. Meanwhile, across town, Nathan quietly entered a small community library. He needed to disappear, not just from the media, but from himself. The walls of the library smelled of old paper and calm. Inside, the world's noise seemed suspended by some invisible pact of silence. Seated among forgotten books, Nathan breathed more freely. He was tired of being chased by cameras and judgment. The park bench still burned vividly in his memory, more than the altar he had walked away from. The woman who had offered him coffee without knowing his name had left a mark he couldn't shake. And in the middle of all the chaos, that peaceful moment with her was the only thing he longed to repeat. Even if he didn't know how, for the first time in a long time, he felt like writing. He pulled a small notepad and pen from the inside pocket of his jacket and began scribbling. He didn't know what exactly he was writing, just that something inside him needed to come out. He drew the park, the bench, a woman with her hair tied back and eyes that listened. Then he wrote, "She stayed. And that's what saved me." For a moment, the words surprised him, but he didn't cross them out. Something inside was already changing, even if the world hadn't noticed. While he wrote, Alyssa finished her shift with deep under-eye circles and weary steps. Before heading home, she stopped by the neighborhood market to grab rice and milk. In the checkout line, she heard people once again talking about the runaway billionaire groom. This time, the comments were harsher. "These rich folks don't know what they want. If it were me, I'd marry blindfolded." She didn't respond, just felt a quiet discomfort, like hearing an injustice and not knowing how to defend it without revealing too much. Nathan didn't seem like someone who ran for fun. He looked like someone running to survive. Her home was silent when she arrived. She flipped on the lights with muscle memory, kicked off her shoes, washed her face, and tied her hair into a loose bun. Turning on her grandmother's old radio, soft instrumental music filled the space. At that moment, she thought about how life changes without warning, how a park bench can become the stage for an encounter that shifts everything. She felt, though she didn't want to, that this story wasn't over yet. And if the universe wanted to play with destiny, she wouldn't hide. As Alyssa lay down, Nathan walked once more through the narrow streets of Willow Spring. He wore a dark beanie and simpler clothes, trying to stay under the radar. The small town offered anonymity, but not for long. People were starting to stare a little longer, even if subtly. He reached the park and stood before the bench from the day before. The wood creaked beneath the weight of memory. He sat down again, alone once more, waiting for something he couldn't name. The next morning, Alyssa woke before her alarm, as if pulled by an old intuition. She dressed quickly and took her usual path, but her steps were lighter. When she spotted the park, her heart sped up. There he was, sitting in the same spot, his face hidden beneath the beanie. She took a deep breath, resisting the urge to run to him. Instead, she walked slowly to the bench and sat beside him, saying nothing. The silence between them felt the same, but now carried recognition. "I came back because I couldn't really leave," he said, not looking directly at her. Alyssa held her coffee cup, took a sip, and offered him some. "Then I guess it's your lucky day again," she replied with a faint smile. Nathan accepted, and for the first time, smiled back, though shyly. The town bustled unnoticed around them, but on that bench, the world felt like it held only two strangers and something yet unnamed. "Why did you listen to me yesterday?" he asked, his voice firmer now. "Because no one listens to those who scream on the inside," she answered, without hesitation. Nathan stayed silent for a few seconds, absorbing her answer like someone hearing an unexpected truth. People usually talk to him out of interest, expectation, or judgment, but never pure empathy. Somehow, Alyssa saw past the surface. It left him unbalanced, yet strangely at ease. "You saw me even without knowing who I was. That's rare." She shrugged, eyes fixed ahead. "Maybe because I once wanted to be seen for who I really was, too." And in that moment, without even touching hands, something aligned between them. "They'll find you here," Alyssa said, still not looking at him. "I know," he replied, with a hint of resignation in his voice. "There's a small hotel on the back street. Not many people pass by. I can show you." Nathan raised an eyebrow, surprised by the unexpected offer. "I'm not great at running," she added with a smirk, "but I'm very good at hiding when I need to." He laughed for the first time, a short, almost surprised laugh. "Maybe I really am lucky." They stood up together, walking side by side down a cobbled street. Their pace was slow, unhurried, as if neither wanted to break the moment. The town was still waking up lazily, and few people noticed the man in a beanie and the woman with a backpack. "Why did you run?" she asked finally, without sugarcoating it. Nathan sighed. "Because I realized I would lose myself forever if I said yes. And now, I try to find out who I am, far from who they expect me to be." They arrived at the modest hotel, its worn facade and beige curtains covering small windows. Alyssa nodded toward the reception desk with her chin, but didn't go in. "It's better if you go alone. Fewer questions." Nathan nodded, though. He hesitated before stepping away. "Can I see you tomorrow? If it's the same bench, same time." "Maybe," she replied with a smile. He watched her for one more second, as if capturing a precious detail before walking inside the hospital. Alyssa tried to stay focused, but her mind kept wandering. Between one patient and another, fragments of the conversation echoed in her memory. There was something about Nathan that stirred her own buried wounds, like he carried questions that resembled hers. In the halls, people still gossiped about the scandal, spinning theories and wild tales. But she was the only one who knew what he truly felt in those minutes of silence. The only one who had seen him stripped of everything, except his essence. And because of that, she could no longer pretend it didn't matter. That night, in her small bedroom, Alyssa returned to her notebook. "Today, someone looked at me as if trying to remember who they were. And I stayed, because sometimes, what we need isn't an explanation, but a place where the soul can breathe." The words flowed more easily now, as if her heart had found space on the page. There was beauty in shared pain, and Alyssa was beginning to understand that maybe her story wasn't alone anymore. Meanwhile, in the hotel's cramped room, Nathan stared at the ceiling once again. But this time, the anguish had given way to something else, a feeling of beginning. He picked up his notepad again and wrote a single line. "The woman without a name gave mine back to me." He smiled at the absurdity of it, but didn't erase it. Instead, he folded the paper and tucked it into his wallet. Then, with the muffled sound of the city in the background, he drifted off, lighter than he had felt in a very long time. The following days passed slowly, as if time itself respected the depth of their thoughts. Alyssa and Nathan began meeting, discreetly, always on the same bench, always at the same hour. They spoke little, but when they did, the words carried weight and meaning. They shared silences, memories, and doubts they'd never had the courage to say out loud before. Trust grew like a resilient plant, nourished not by promises, but by presence. And between glances and long pauses, something new was forming, fragile, but real, something that defied everything they thought they knew about love. Neither of them called it romance, perhaps out of fear, or maybe out of respect for the time they still needed. But there was tenderness in the gestures, recognition in the eyes, and an unspoken promise floating between them. Alyssa didn't want to be rescued, and Nathan wasn't looking to be fixed. They simply allowed each other to be seen, fully and truthfully. And that simple permission was a rare miracle. A miracle born in silence, blossoming slowly. At the end of that second meeting, before parting ways, Nathan hesitantly reached into his pocket. He handed her a folded piece of paper. "If I disappear again, this will lead you to me." Alyssa accepted it gently, not opening it right away. She just looked at him and said, "This time, I know how to disappear too." They both smiled, different, transformed, and undeniably changed. And fate watched from afar, already preparing the next turn in their story. The next morning, the square seemed livelier than usual. The clear sky reflected an intense blue, and the tree leaves danced in the gentle breeze. Alyssa arrived earlier than usual, not really knowing why she had hurried. She sat on the bench, with freshly brewed coffee and Nathan's note still folded in her jacket pocket. During the night, she had read those words at least 5 times, and still didn't fully understand them. There was something both promising and threatening in that small paper, a path a choice, maybe a warning. But what unsettled her most was the feeling that she was already involved in something she could no longer ignore. Nathan arrived minutes later, wearing a gray hoodie and sunglasses that barely hid his well-known face. The city was beginning to notice him. Glances lingered longer, whispers formed on corners. Even so, he seemed calmer, as if he finally knew what he was looking for. He sat beside Alyssa with a slight nod and took the extra cup she had brought. "You know you won't be able to hide forever, right?" she said with a soft smile. "Actually, I'm starting to think maybe I don't want to hide anymore." "Then why the disguises?" she teased, making him laugh quietly. For long minutes, they talked about everything and nothing. She spoke of her childhood in the countryside, of the snacks she sold at school to help at home. Nathan listened intently, visibly moved by the simple, honest stories she shared so lightly. At one point, he mentioned the hospital where she worked. "I wouldn't have pictured you taking care of people all day." "Why?" "Because I look more like someone who needs care than someone who gives it." "No, it's just that you listen with your eyes. That's rare." Alyssa looked away, slightly flustered, but let a shy smile slip. Nathan was still a mystery, but he was slowly shedding the layers that made him unreachable. She noticed it in the details, in how his shoulders were less tense now, or how his hands trembled less holding the cup. That silent transformation touched her more than any declaration ever could. And in some way, it moved her too, as if the space she had offered him also opened a space within herself. A place someone could enter, without needing permission. "Have you ever thought about leaving for good?" he asked, breaking the silence gently. "I have, many times. And why didn't you?" "Because my grandma always said that those who run from pain run from themselves. And I decided I wanted to find myself, even if it hurt." Nathan remained silent for a few seconds. "You say things that make me want to be better. Maybe because I still believe everyone can change. Even you." The square began to fill with children and mothers with strollers, and they knew it was time to go. Alyssa stood first, adjusting the strap of her backpack on her shoulder. "I'm not going straight to the hospital today. I need to stop by a lady's house I care for on Saturdays." Nathan stood too, hesitating for a moment. "Can I come with you?" The question surprised him more than it surprised her. She looked at him, assessing. "She likes company, but you'll have to listen to stories about cats, soap operas, and beet soup." "Sounds better than a forced wedding," he replied, making her burst into genuine laughter. The lady's house was a few blocks away, hidden among rose bushes and ivy climbing the low wall. Mrs. Norma welcomed them with a toothless smile and bright eyes despite her age. "This is my friend Nathan," Alyssa introduced, avoiding details. "Better looking than the ones you never brought," the old lady said bluntly, earning a laugh from him. They spent an hour there, listening to old tales, organizing medications, and watering the backyard plants. Nathan seemed genuinely touched by the simplicity and dignity of that woman's routine. And Alyssa, watching him from a distance, realized how much he had already changed. On the way back, they walked slowly along the uneven sidewalks. Nathan looked pensive, hands in his pockets, eyes on the ground. "You live with little, but seem to have so much," he said, almost as a realization. "Because I've learned to recognize what can't be bought." "Like what?" "Like peace, silence with meaning, eyes that don't demand, presence that doesn't suffocate." Nathan paused for a second, as if carving that into his soul. That afternoon, he returned to the hotel with a restless heart. He felt he needed to do something, not for her, but for himself. He went to the front desk, picked up the old laptop he had carried in his backpack since he fled, and locked himself in his room. For hours, he searched through files, contracts, old proposals. Between spreadsheets, he found the draft of a social project he had abandoned years ago, something his father once called a waste of time. But now, those ideas made sense. Alyssa made him remember why he once dreamed of that. He decided it was time to start over. And this time, it had to be real, not just an elegant escape. He messaged 2 former partners, asked for discretion, but made it clear he wanted to return, with a different kind of purpose. No grand ceremony, nothing for the press. A small project, rooted in the city, focused on real people. Something involving health, education, and presence. He thought of Alyssa the entire time he was writing. She didn't know it yet, but she was lighting up a part of him he didn't know existed. That evening, Alyssa returned home with tired feet and a full mind. It had been a simple day, like so many others, but with a detail that made everything different. Nathan. He wasn't just the billionaire from TV or the man who ran from the altar. He was someone who listened, who didn't hide when he felt fear, and who, little by little, was learning to stay. She lay on the couch with a blanket over her legs and a cup of hot tea in her hands. Deep down, she tried not to expect anything, but she couldn't deny it. He was already living in a quiet corner of her heart. As night fell over the city, Nathan returned to the square. He needed to walk, to breathe the same air that made him stop that first day. He carried a bag with 2 fresh rolls and a folded note. On the empty bench, he sat and placed the bag between his knees. There, under the yellow glow of the lampposts and the distant chimes of a church bell, he wrote a new message. "Tomorrow, I'll show you a part of me I never knew existed." He folded the paper, tucked it into the bag, and waited. The next morning, Alyssa arrived at the square later than usual. She had missed the bus and almost didn't come, convinced she might be going too far with this unlikely bond. But upon spotting the bag on the bench, she knew it was too late to turn back. Inside, she found 2 rolls, a bottle of still-warm coffee, and the note. She read slowly, like someone afraid of understanding too soon. Her heart clenched, not because of what was written, but because of what it said without words. Nathan was trying, and she knew how much that cost him. That same afternoon, he picked her up outside the hospital. No luxury car or bodyguards, just a man, hands in his pockets, eyes asking for permission. "Do you trust me for an hour?" he asked. She nodded, not knowing where they were going. They walked side by side through quiet streets until they reached a plot surrounded by trees and native flowers. "This place will be our beginning," he said, voice thick with emotion. Alyssa looked around, confused. "Our?" Nathan pulled an old tablet from his pocket and showed her the project slides. It was a community clinic, with rooms for free care, emotional health workshops, support for single mothers and at-risk youth. This plan was shelved for years because I was someone else. But now, I want to do this for real. Here, with what I have, with who I am. Alyssa felt a lump in her throat, surprised by his vulnerability. "And what do I have to do with this?" she whispered. "Everything," he replied firmly. "You showed me that presence matters more than promises. That listening can save someone. This idea isn't just mine. It's yours too, even if you don't know it. Because it was your silence, Alyssa, that woke me up." She didn't know what to say. She just took a deep breath, holding back tears. She knew how much that meant coming from someone who was trained never to feel. The construction hadn't begun yet, but something already existed there. A new ground beneath their feet. Nathan looked at her like someone offering more than a project. He was offering a piece of himself. It may not be the prettiest place, or the fastest to build, but it'll be real, and it'll care for people the way you do. She ran her hand through her hair, visibly moved. "Then let's do it. But only if it's real, Nathan." He smiled, a smile that came not from pride, but from vulnerability. There, on that empty plot of land, something was born, and it wasn't just concrete for the future. It was trust, and more than that, it was choice. They didn't know what they would be from now on, but they knew they weren't the same anymore. And sometimes, that's enough to begin, even when everything is still to come. On the way home, Alyssa felt light, as if an anchor had been lifted from her chest. There were no certainties, promises, or labels, but there was a gesture, an invitation, a real possibility. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future beyond loneliness. And in that quiet dream, Nathan's face appeared not as a savior, but as someone who finally stayed, not out of obligation, but by choice. That night, she wrote one more line in her notebook before bed. "What money can't buy is what matters most when everything falls apart." She closed her eyes with a soft smile, feeling alive, whole, and at peace. Meanwhile, across town, Nathan stared at the plans spread out on the bed and typed the project's name, Alyssa Clinic. It was more than a gesture. It was a declaration. The first works on the land began with slow, quiet steps. Nathan hired local workers, chose suppliers from town, and refused any big announcement. He wanted that place to be different from its foundation, real, humble, rooted. Alyssa visited the site every day after her shift, helping however she could, from organizing boxes to serving coffee to the construction workers. Even tired, her eyes sparkled with a new light. It was as if, for the first time, she had a project that was also taking care of her. But the comfortable silence would soon be interrupted by an unexpected knock that on Thursday morning, Nathan left the hotel and saw a black car parked across the street. Inside, a familiar face stared coldly at him. Amanda, ex-fiancée, political alliance, heiress of another empire. He knew she would show up eventually. Amanda never accepted losing, even when the cause was already lost. As he approached, she stepped out of the car with the confident heels of someone who didn't come to negotiate. This ridiculous escape has gone on long enough. Come back now and I'll handle the press. Nathan didn't flinch. I don't want to be controlled. Not by the media, and especially not by you. Amanda laughed bitterly. You think you can disappear and pretend this pathetic little town will save you? I'm not running. I'm starting over. With who? That second-rate nurse? You don't belong in this world, Nathan. The mention of Alyssa made his blood boil, but he kept his tone steady. That's exactly why I chose to be here. Because for the first time, I feel like I belong. Amanda narrowed her eyes. You're throwing everything away. Business, reputation, legacy. I'm throwing away what was never truly mine. The argument lasted only minutes, but it left a trail. Amanda promised, if you don't come back, I'll expose everything. Even her. Nathan didn't answer. He simply stared at her like he no longer recognized who he once knew. He returned to the hotel with a heavy chest, feeling a weight he hadn't carried in weeks. He needed to warn Alyssa, protect her from something she didn't even know she was involved in. But part of him feared that it would drive her away. How could he tell her that the past could still reach them? Even here, that evening, they met at the site as usual. She arrived smiling, carrying a bag of sandwiches for the workers, unaware of the storm about to hit. Nathan was waiting by the makeshift container they used as an office. We need to talk, he said bluntly. Her smile faded. Of course. They walked to the back of the lot, where the machines couldn't be heard. There, he told her everything. Alyssa listened in silence, not interrupting, though her expression changed with each sentence. When he mentioned Amanda, her eyes narrowed, not out of jealousy, but instinct. She could sense danger, even when it came dressed in heels and expensive perfume. What does she want with me? It's not about you. It's about what you represent, the choice I made. And she can't stand to lose, Alyssa said, as if she already knew the type. Nathan wanted to spare her, but Alyssa wasn't someone who ran away. She can try whatever she wants. I have nothing to hide. But she has power, contacts, and money. And I have truth. I have roots here. For a moment, he saw her stronger than any wall he'd ever known. She wasn't the one who needed protection. He was the one learning what it meant to stand beside someone real. Even so, the seed of fear had already been planted. The next morning, social media exploded. Gossip pages spread old photos of Amanda and Nathan, followed by malicious captions. Dumped at the altar for a small-town nurse. Rita cruel. Headline. Alyssa found out from a colleague at the hospital and saw her name plastered across comments she never wanted to read. At work, the stares were heavy. At the market, the whispers hurt. But what hurt most was realizing that the peace she always protected was now at risk. And not by her own choice. Nathan tried to shield her, calling lawyers, requesting content removals. But the internet is like fire on dry grass. Once lit, no one controls it. That afternoon, as Alyssa left the hospital, she found Amanda leaning against her car. The conversation was short, cold. He always comes back to what's his, Amanda said before walking away with the same imposing stride. But Alyssa didn't flinch. She simply replied with firmness. Then maybe you never had anything but his last name. Even keeping her composure, Alyssa got home with stinging eyes. She shut the door, took off her shoes, and sat on the floor, breath caught in her chest. Everything she feared was happening, being seen through distorted lenses, being reduced to a name in a tabloid. She knew she wasn't guilty, but still it hurt. Nathan called several times that night. She didn't answer. She needed space to process, to remember who she was before him. Before all of this, the night fell like a thick veil, no stars visible, just distant cars and noisy thoughts. Alyssa sat at the kitchen table with a forgotten mug of tea. In front of her, the printed headlines from the hospital colleague, making the humiliation feel more real. She didn't cry, didn't scream, but something inside her quietly came undone. Why, even doing everything right, did she feel like the ground was slipping away? She fought so hard for peace, and now the world barged in uninvited. Worst of all, she didn't know if she could carry it and still hold on to herself. Nathan didn't sleep. He paced back and forth in the hotel room, hands in his hair, eyes red. It wasn't fear of scandal, public image, or lawsuits. It was fear of losing her, of having dragged her light into a shadow that still clung to him. With every unanswered call, he felt closer to repeating the past, pushing away what mattered most. He wanted to write, show up at her door, beg. But he understood, sometimes presence isn't forced. It's waited for. The next morning, Alyssa walked to the park. The bench was still there, motionless as always, but something about it felt different. She sat, not knowing if he'd come. The world around her moved on, but inside, there was a pause. A waiting. She didn't want him to save her, just needed space to breathe again. And maybe, deep down, hoped he would learn to listen without trying to fix. Like she had done for him. Nathan appeared in the distance, unhurried, hands in his pockets, heart in his eyes. He brought no flowers or explanations. He simply sat beside her, saying nothing. Minutes passed in silence, just the two of them, the breeze, and a city unaware. "You didn't have to drag me into this," she said, not angry, just hurt. "I know," he replied, "but if I turned back, I'd lose the truest part of me." "And that's me?" she asked, voice trembling. Nathan turned to her, not hiding his fragility. "You're the first thing I chose without pressure, without calculation, without fear." Alyssa took a deep breath, trying to swallow the lump in her throat. "I don't want to be another consequence of your escape." "You're not an escape. You're the courage I never had." The words didn't erase everything, but they cracked open the wall of hurt. And sometimes, that's where the light gets in. Still, Alyssa knew she needed time. "I don't know what to do now." "Then just stay?" "Not for me. For yourself." She looked at him, searching for something familiar in his gaze. And she found it. Truth. For the first time since the chaos began, she saw Nathan as he truly was. Not the title. Not the fortune. Not the guilt. Just a man trying to stay. The days that followed moved slowly, cautiously. Alyssa took a week off from the hospital. She needed to care for herself. Nathan kept showing up at the construction site, continuing the project, even without knowing if she would return. And with every brick laid, he also let go of a piece of the anxiety that consumed him. Meanwhile, Alyssa returned to walking alone, like she used to. But now, each step carried a lingering question. Was there still space for him in her life? Or does love, when wounded too early, not survive? On Friday, Nathan left an envelope on the bench at the square. Inside was a sketch of the project with the name changed, rooted space, no mention of him, no dedications. Below it, a single sentence. "You taught me the strongest roots grow in silence." And at the bottom, a handwritten line. "If you choose to stay, meet me where it all began." He folded the envelope and left it there, like someone planting a seed unsure if they'll ever see it bloom. Alyssa arrived later that day. She found the envelope and read every word like someone opening a wound that hadn't quite healed. She stood there, the paper between her fingers, while the sun slowly dipped beneath the horizon. She didn't know if she forgave, or trusted, or wanted again. But one thing was clear, that love wasn't shallow. It had been planted in real ground, with pain, with truth, with silence. And maybe that was enough to try once more. As night fell, she walked slowly to the square. The bench was already occupied. Nathan, head down, was absent-mindedly twirling a twig between his fingers. When he sensed her presence, he lifted his gaze. And there, with no promises or defenses, he smiled. Alyssa sat beside him. She said nothing. She simply reached out and gently touched his hand. The gesture was small, but it said everything. And in both their hearts, one truth quietly blossomed. Sometimes, staying is the bravest thing you can do. The reunion on the park bench didn't come with fireworks, declarations, or rushed kisses. It was just presence, hands held in silence and eyes that carried both weariness and tenderness. In that still moment, Nathan and Alyssa understood something vital, Love doesn't need urgency, it needs courage. Courage to keep going, even when everything around says it would be easier to let go. They didn't resolve everything that day. They didn't erase all the pain or seal any grand promises. But they chose something far more valuable: to stay. And they started again, not from where they left off, but from a new, wiser place. Alyssa returned to the hospital the following week, greeted by discreet hugs and polite smiles trying to erase old gossip. Time had done its quiet work. The dust from the media storm had started to settle. Some offered apologies for believing rumors. Others kept their distance, unsure how to face someone who had chosen not to back down. She, in turn, walked forward with steadier steps and sharper eyes. The criticism still stung, but it no longer shaped her sense of worth. She now knew the truth has roots deeper than any scandal. Nathan, on the other hand, had quietly changed. His routine. He left the hotel and rented a small cabin on the outskirts of town. He wanted to build something steady, for himself and for the project. Mornings were spent overseeing construction at Rooted Space, afternoons drafting new plans. For social outreach, at night, he often walked to the square, even when Alyssa didn't go. It had become his quiet ritual of constancy. As if the bench had become more than a place. It was now a symbol. They saw each other often, but now respected one another's space. There were no demands, only invitations. "Want to have dinner with me tonight?" he'd ask, bringing something simple he'd cooked. "Meet me after my shift," she'd say, still in her wrinkled apron. Every meeting was casual, unassuming, yet filled with care. In the simple gestures, sharing a cup of tea, listening without interruption, remembering her favorite flavor, love quietly grew. Not as a wild flame, but as a steady ember, gently warming them both. One Friday night, Nathan took her to see the inside of the new building. Still unfinished, the clinic smelled of fresh paint and echoed with their footsteps. Alyssa walked the halls with her fingers brushing the walls, as if committing each inch to memory. When they reached the main room, she stopped in front of a plaque covered with fabric. Nathan smiled and pulled the cloth away. Etched in metal, it read, "Where presence heals." She couldn't hold back the tears. "This is the purpose, Alyssa," he said. "It's not about charity. It's about presence, about listening, about staying." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, deeply moved. "You really are changing. You helped me remember who I was before all of this." They embraced there, in the middle of the construction, surrounded by dust and future. That embrace was more intimate than any kiss. It was surrender. The meeting of two hearts that had become shelter for one another. In the days that followed, they began planning workshops and projects to bring the space to life. Alyssa proposed sessions for single mothers and caregivers, something close to her heart. Nathan researched sustainable donation models that didn't rely on corporate sponsors. They had different visions, but they complemented one another. Sure, there were disagreements, but always handled with respect and open ears. They knew what they were building wasn't just concrete. It was emotional foundation, but the past doesn't vanish, it only changes form. A journalist from a major business magazine emailed Nathan, requesting an exclusive interview. The topic? His new beginning in Willow Spring and the woman who saved his name. Nathan politely declined, but Alyssa's name was already back in the headlines. She read the article over breakfast days later, her heart heavy, not from shame, but because, for once, she wished her life could belong solely to her. That night, she showed up at Nathan's cabin unannounced. She found him sitting on the porch, reading in silence. She handed him the magazine, arms crossed. "I'm not a headline, Nathan." "I know," he replied, not defending himself. "But I'm tired of my name being tied to yours. To your escape. To your money. Do you want me to disappear?" he asked softly. She sat next to him, quiet for a few seconds. "No, I just want to exist for myself." Nathan took a deep breath and gently held her hand. "Then from now on, I'll follow your lead. No spotlights, no plaques with my name, no grand promises. Just presence. That's all," she answered. And in that moment, it was everything. The next morning, Nathan rewrote all the public guidelines for the project. He removed his name from every page, reshaped the communications to highlight the team, the community, the collective. He wanted Rooted Space to be bigger than him, stronger than any headline. It was a quiet, nearly invisible gesture, but filled with meaning. That afternoon, he slipped a handwritten note into Alyssa's backpack without signing it. It read, "To love is to give the truest part of yourself, without needing applause." She read it and knew. He understood. Between hospital shifts and planning meetings, life found rhythm again. The media buzz faded, replaced by genuine curiosity about the project. Town residents began to offer help, donations, time. Alyssa led a small team of volunteers, teaching patiently, smiling gently. Nathan watched from afar, captivated by how she touched lives. Not with speeches, but with presence. One rainy afternoon, while organizing files at the clinic, the power went out. The lights vanished, but they didn't rush to leave. They sat on the floor, surrounded by boxes and laughter. "Have you ever thought maybe this place chose us?" she asked, resting her head on his shoulder. "If it did, it made a good choice." Nathan laced his fingers through hers. "I wouldn't know how to go back to who I was before." Rain tapped gently on the windows, creating a soft and intimate backdrop. Alyssa closed her eyes for a moment, sinking her breath to his. It was a comfortable silence, the kind shared by people who no longer need to prove anything. There were no longer a billionaire and a nurse, only two hearts that had learned how to listen. And through listening and presence, what she always believed came to life. True love is simple. It doesn't shout. It doesn't demand. It stays. When the lights came back on, they laughed like kids and resumed their work as if nothing had happened. But something had changed. Their intimacy was no longer built on tension or sudden discoveries. It was woven from shared routine, warm tea at days, and quiet glances that said more than words. Alyssa had never wanted to depend on anyone, and Nathan had grown tired of being someone who only knew how to command. Together, they were learning to be two, without losing who they were alone. One Friday evening, he showed up at her door with a simple envelope. Alyssa opened it in her pajamas, hair tied up, barefoot as always. "This is for you," he said, handing it over. Inside was a document, the official deed transferring rooted space to the community. "You're giving it all away?" she asked, surprised. "I'm giving back what never should have belonged only to me." She didn't say anything. She just hugged him tightly. The months that followed brought stability. The clinic was inaugurated with a quiet ceremony. No press, just townspeople and real stories. Alyssa gave a short speech, not rehearsed, but heartfelt. Nathan stood in the back, discreet, his eyes glistening. He had become the man he always wanted to be and never needed to announce it. Because now, everything he did had roots. And roots, he had learned, are invisible, but they hold up everything. One night, while washing dishes side by side, she looked at him and asked softly, "Are you still afraid of staying?" Nathan dried his hands and held her face gently. "Now, I'm afraid of leaving." She smiled tenderly, resting her forehead against his. "Then we care for this place, one day at a time." One silence at a time, he whispered back, "What they built wasn't perfect. There were still insecurities, differences, challenges. But now, they both knew true love isn't proven with grand gestures. It's proven through constancy, through the daily choice to listen, to respect, to stay." Nathan and Alyssa didn't become different people. They simply returned to who they had always been, but now, together. And that made all the difference. That night, sitting on the bench where everything began, they toasted with mugs of hot tea. Alyssa's eyes were calm, and Nathan's smile was soft, unguarded. "Staying is the most revolutionary act of all," she whispered. "And loving in silence is the most beautiful way to say I love you," he replied. They looked at each other as if all the words they needed were already inside. And then they just stayed. Because love, at last, had learned how to remain. Spring arrived with longer days and flowers blooming across the city's gardens. At Rooted Space, the movement grew stronger. Children laughed in the hallways, mothers exchanged stories, and volunteers became part of a new family. Alyssa led everything with grace, balancing hospital shifts with emotional care workshops. Nathan, now deeply woven into the town's daily life, walked the streets with a quiet and serene gaze. People no longer saw him as the outsider millionaire. He was simply Nathan, the man who built with his own hands. At night, he and Alyssa shared silences and warm soups. slowly learning that love lives in the smallest details. Until, like life often does, the unexpected knocked on their door. Alyssa woke up with a strange pain on the right side of her abdomen. It wasn't intense, but persistent, like a thread of discomfort that wouldn't go away. She tried to ignore it, went to the hospital, attended patients, smiled like always. But in the afternoon, a wave of dizziness forced her to lean against the hallway wall. A colleague saw her and insisted she run some tests. With nervous laughter and soft denial, Alyssa agreed. After all, it was just exhaustion. Or at least, that's what she wanted to believe. The tests started simple, but the doctor requested more, just to be safe. 2 days later, the results arrived. A small ovarian cyst with a risk of complication. Nothing serious, they said, but surgery would be needed. And afterward, rest. Alyssa listened calmly, but her heart quietly sank. Not because of the procedure itself, but because of the feeling of losing control. She, who cared for everyone, would now need to be cared for. Nathan heard the news directly from her lips that evening as they sat on their usual bench. She spoke naturally, trying not to appear fragile, but he saw in her eyes the fear she didn't put into words. "It's going to be okay," he said, firmly holding her hand. "I know, but I hate feeling vulnerable. Your vulnerability is what taught me what strength truly is." Alyssa smiled, discreet tears forming. For the first time, she didn't have to be strong alone. The surgery was scheduled for the following week. In the days leading up to it, Nathan reorganized everything. He led meetings, shared tasks with the team, and prepared the cabin for her recovery. Alyssa hesitated at first, but gave in. She knew resisting his care now would be pride, not love. On the day of her admission, Nathan held her hand until she was taken into surgery. "When you wake up, I'll be right here," he promised. She simply nodded, her face already framed by the surgical cap. And he stayed, without blinking. The hours in the waiting room felt like days. Nathan didn't touch his phone, didn't flip through a magazine, didn't pace. He simply sat still, like a quiet pillar, staring at the door. When the doctor came out, saying everything went well, Nathan just exhaled deeply. It was the first time he let fear fully pass through him. The fear of losing her. The fear of never hearing her say the tea was too lukewarm again. And he understood. Love also means surrendering control. During the days of recovery, Alyssa stayed at the cabin. Nathan wrapped her in blankets, made soups, read book passages aloud. She, still weak, watched it all with teary eyes and quiet gratitude. She had never imagined depending so deeply on someone. But with him, there was no burden. There was lightness, even in surrender. He didn't invade. He was simply there. And that was love. One night, she woke up with mild pain and held back tears. Nathan sat beside her and just embraced her. She tried to explain, but he stopped her. "You don't have to be strong now. I'm whole when you let yourself fall apart." Alyssa cried into his chest, knowing that perhaps this was the most intimate moment they had ever shared. Because there, no masks remained. There was just surrender. Once she was strong enough to walk steadily, the first place she wanted to go was the clinic. The volunteers welcomed her with hugs and garden-picked flowers. Nathan stood beside her, smiling like someone watching a daily miracle. She walked the hallways with slower steps, but her eyes shone brighter than ever. Nothing had changed there, and yet everything seemed more beautiful. Because now, Alyssa carried not just her usual strength, but also the choice of having allowed someone to care for her. In the main room, once filled with silence, children now colored at bright tables. Alyssa sat among them, picked up a blue crayon, and began to color a page. Nathan watched from a distance, smiling. One of the children approached him and asked, "Is she your girlfriend?" He paused for a second, then replied, "She's the one who taught me how to listen to love." And in that moment, he knew they were ready for whatever came next. Alyssa stayed at the clinic for a few hours, smiling and listening as she always had. But now, there was something different in her presence. Not the strength of someone who handles everything, but the lightness of someone who knows they no longer have to face life alone. At the end of the day, Nathan picked her up, holding an extra coat and a paper bag with fresh muffins. "You look more like yourself," he said, helping her into the car. "Maybe it's because, for the first time, I allowed myself to be whole, with all my flaws." He gently squeezed her hand. and I've loved every one of them. That night, rain returned to Willow Spring, washing the streets and filling the air with the scent of wet earth. Inside the cabin, Alyssa lay on the couch, wrapped in a soft blanket, while Nathan wrote in his journal. It had become his habit since returning to town, recording the small miracles of each day. But that night, he didn't write about the project or the clinic. He wrote about her, about the way she breathed while sleeping, and how, even in silence, she seemed to hold the entire world in her gaze. The next morning, Alyssa found a small box on the table with a note. No rush, no noise, only when the time feels right. But this is my step. Inside the box, a simple ring with a tiny root engraved on the inside of the band. No diamonds, no shiny gold, just the symbol of what they had built, something that grows slowly but lasts. She didn't cry. She smiled, because that gesture asked for no answer. It was just a seed, and she knew how to care for seeds. The days flowed quietly, marked by silent coffees and glances that said everything. They didn't talk about the ring. They didn't need to. Both knew that love doesn't need a spotlight to exist. In truth, the most beautiful love is built between words, in making tea and covering each other when it's cold, in listening without interrupting, in staying. Even when leaving would be easier. One Sunday, during an impromptu picnic on the square where everything began, Nathan pulled out an envelope. It was the finalized project for Rooted Spaces expansion, now with new wings focused on emotional care. He pointed to the section naming the new area, Alyssa and Other Silences. She touched the paper with her fingertips, moved. This isn't about me. It's about what you represent, he said gently. Listening, presence, and what saves without saying a word. Alyssa laid back on the blanket, looking up at the cloudless sky. Nathan laid beside her, resting his head on her shoulder. For a few minutes, they just breathed together, in rhythm, like a quiet song. Do you still feel afraid? She asked, eyes closed. Every day, he answered. But now I know I can feel fear and still stay. She turned to face him and smiled. Then we're learning, together. Time passed, but their love didn't need to rush. It grew like all things real, slowly but deeply. The town learned to respect them. The project flourished, and the two continued walking side by side, sometimes in silence, sometimes in laughter, but always with truth. Alyssa didn't become someone else. She simply bloomed, finally without fear. Nathan, in turn, let go of the weight of being the perfect son or the heir everyone expected. He was just a man, one who had learned to shed his ego and clothe himself in listening, and who discovered that presence heals more than any speech. In Alyssa's company, he learned to see the world with new eyes, softer eyes, eyes full of soul. One night, sitting on the porch of the cabin, she asked in a low voice, "Did you know it would all begin on that bench?" He smiled, looking at her hands woven into his. "That day, I thought I was running away, but really, I was finding my way back to myself, and you were the path." She rested her head on his shoulder, like someone finally arriving home. The moon bathed the garden in quiet light as the wind gently moved the curtains. There, without loud promises, without a ring on her finger, without an audience, they celebrated what they had built. Not with applause, but with constancy. Not with eternal vows, but with daily choices. Their love didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to be real. And real it was. It was an ordinary autumn morning when Nathan received the email. The sender was a name he hadn't seen in months. The CEO of a multinational partner of the old Lancaster Empire. The invitation was clear, direct, and tempting. To take the vice presidency of the company in London, with full autonomy, a millionaire's salary, and global prestige. Nathan read and reread the message countless times, feeling the old world calling him back. There was no pressure, no demand, just an offer, an open door. But every open door requires a choice. For hours, he wandered the town aimlessly. He passed the square where he first met Alyssa, the streets scented with fresh bread, the children now smiling at the clinic. The offer was too good and dangerous because of it. It would be easy to return to the top, to lead with status, and be applauded again. But easy wasn't the same as right. And for the first time in a long while, he didn't know what he wanted. He felt torn between the man he once was and the man he was becoming. That night, Nathan said nothing to Alyssa. He made dinner as usual, laughed at the hospital stories, and brought her honey tea. But Alyssa knew his silences. She sensed something different in his eyes, a quiet weight on his shoulders. Still, she didn't press. She gave him space. Because loving also means knowing when to wait for the truth. 2 days later, he finally asked her to talk. They were on the porch, wrapped in the gentle chill of the night, hands warmed by ceramic mugs. They offered me something big. Again, Alyssa didn't ask what. She simply looked into his eyes. And do you want to accept it? Nathan hesitated. Part of me, yes, but not the part that matters. Then you already know your answer, she whispered. He smiled with melancholy, amazed at her clarity. But what if I wanted to take you with me? Alyssa leaned back in her chair and took a deep breath. I wasn't made for stages, or for cities where we get lost trying to be someone. London is beautiful, he tried, but Willow Spring is where I find myself. Her words were gentle and final. Nathan understood, right then, that it wasn't about losing Alyssa. It was about losing himself. The man who wanted to return to London was the same one who once ran away from his own wedding because he couldn't bear living a life that wasn't his. And he knew, going back now would be denying everything he'd built with her. Everything he'd learned about love without spotlights. About small, deep gestures. About the choice to stay. The next morning, he replied to the email with respectful thanks and a firm refusal. He wrote, I've been applauded for being someone I'm not. Today, I'd rather live in silence and be whole. He closed the laptop with the serenity of someone who chose not out of fear, but from truth. At the clinic, he spent the rest of the day helping the kids paint one of the new rooms. He left with paint splashes on his arms and a light smile on his lips. Alyssa found him later that afternoon, just like always. But this time, he was different, more rooted than ever. Without saying a word, Nathan hugged her tightly in the hallway. In his gesture, she understood the choice had been made. Not London, not the past, but her, this town, the quiet purpose they'd built together. That night, he took her up to a hilltop where the whole town twinkled below. There, under a sky filled with stars, he opened a small notebook. I wrote everything I've learned since I sat on that bench. Alyssa listened silently, moved. With each page, a lesson, a pain, a surrender. And in the end, he said, you didn't just change my life, you gave me back to myself. She held his hand and looked into his eyes. And what are you going to do with this new version of you? Stay, he answered, voice steady and eyes glassy. And love you the way you deserve, without rush, without noise, without leaving. Alyssa didn't reply. She simply rested against his chest, listening to the sound she loved most in the world. The breath of someone who chose to stay. Nathan's decision echoed quietly through the town. Some heard about the declined offer and called him crazy. Others admired him even more, not for his fortune, but for his humanity. But he didn't care what they said. True recognition was in the hands he shook every day, in the faces that now trusted him as part of the town, and especially in Alyssa's gaze, which said without words, I know who you are. And that was enough. Rooted space. The new wing was inaugurated with simplicity and warmth. There were no spotlights, no rehearsed speeches, only real stories, shared by real people. Nathan said little. He preferred to listen. Alyssa led everything with her usual grace and strength, like a bridge between the heart of the community and the project's purpose. At the end of the event, an elderly woman approached Nathan, holding his hand with care. You could have left, but you stayed. That's worth more than any gold. Later, sitting on the park bench, he and Alyssa watched the town they now called home. The wind carried dry leaves and recent memories. You know, my favorite version of you is the one that listens more than speaks, she said, leaning her head on his shoulder. And my favorite version of me is the one you helped bring to life, he replied. They stayed like that for minutes, unhurried, just breathing together. That was the value of staying, finding peace in the ordinary, and understanding that love isn't found in promises, but in repetition. Home. Nathan taped a phrase to the wall, one he'd written on the first day of the project. Staying is an act of resistance against everything that taught us to run. He now knew how true those words had become. All his life, he had learned to run, from emotions, from emotional responsibility, from the pain of being seen. But Alyssa taught him there is beauty in being seen and still being accepted. That there is power in staying even when the world offers 1,000 reasons to leave. And that love, when truly heard, can teach even a man like him to become whole. The days that followed were calm. Nothing grand happened, and that was exactly what they valued most now. Walks to the market, tea in the late afternoon, laughter. While doing dishes, they didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. Staying had become part of the routine, and love was no longer an event. It was now part of the everyday, like the air they breathed. Simple, invisible, and essential. On a gray Friday, while sorting papers in the clinic's office, Nathan paused and watched Alyssa for a long moment. She wore a messy ponytail, an old paint-stained shirt, and her glasses slipping down her nose. She was, without a doubt, the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. Not because of her looks, but because of the way she was real, how she was whole, even in the unnoticed details. And because of that, he decided not to leave any questions unasked. That same night, at the foot of the bed, he knelt before her, not with a ring or a formal proposal, but with a promise. I don't know what our next challenge will be, but I know I don't want to face it without you. Alyssa looked at him with teary eyes and a still breath. He reached out, gently holding her hand. So, if one day everything falls apart, promise me we'll rebuild. Here, together. She smiled with her whole face. I promise. Because now, I've also learned to stay. The promise was sealed right there, with a quiet kiss and a long embrace. No applause, no audience, just two hearts that had learned, in practice, what it meant to stay. The world outside would remain demanding, unpredictable, and sometimes unfair. But they had created a place where truth was enough. And in that place, called one another, they were free. Free to stay, free to fall, and free to choose. Always, to rebuild. In the months that followed, rooted space expanded. New partnerships emerged. New branches of the project came to life. But Nathan and Alyssa never let the mission take them away from what truly mattered. The bond that began in silence. The square, the bench, the coffee cups, everything stayed the same. And at the same time, everything ran deeper. Because now, they knew that real love isn't about fleeting intensity. It's about constancy, chosen every single day. On the wall of the clinic's main hallway, a new sign was hung, carved in rustic wood. The love that stays is the one that doesn't need to prove it stayed. Patients passed by every day, some without noticing. But those who read it understood. It was their story, translated into few words. And those who saw them walking side by side through town knew too. True love doesn't leave. It stays. Time passed unhurriedly, just as they had always lived. The seasons changed, but one thing never did: the quiet care between Alyssa and Nathan. Their routine was no longer built on big plans, but on small gestures. The Reyes' center remained, alive, pulsing with stories and hands that healed through listening. They remained, steady and side by side, reaping the fruit of what they had patiently sown. The whole town recognized them, but what mattered most was how they recognized each other. Like those who know they are exactly where they are meant to be. One winter morning, Alyssa walked alone through the square. The wind was cold, but she liked the feeling of being touched by the world in a real way. She sat on the bench where everything began, wrapped in a light blanket and her own silence. She closed her eyes for a few minutes, listening to the sounds of the waking town, footsteps, distant horns, leaves being dragged across the ground. There, more than ever, she understood, life doesn't have to be extraordinary to be beautiful. It just has to be true. And on that bench, she had found her truth. Nathan arrived minutes later, holding 2 steaming cups in his hands. I knew you'd come here, he said, handing her the coffee. It's my favorite place in the world, she replied, leaning into him gently. They remained in silence, as usual, but this silence now carried history, not shyness. Every gesture between them was a memory, every glance, permanence. And there, without words, they knew that something within them was eternal. A few months later, a quiet ceremony was held at the clinic. No fancy dresses or golden invitations, just garden flowers, simple chairs, and the people who were part of their story. Alyssa walked in wearing a light dress and barefoot, just the way she liked. Nathan waited with a restrained smile, the one she had learned to love. They exchanged short vows, handwritten, with the exact words that needed to be said. At the end, he whispered, "Staying is the most beautiful way I've found to love you." Time kept moving, and life, with its gentle twists and turns, did too. Alyssa stayed at the hospital for a few more years until she chose to dedicate herself fully to Raises. Nathan began teaching young people about ethics and purpose, using his story as testimony. He wasn't a speaker or mentor, just someone who chose to be present. The clinic walls filled with new paintings, new phrases, new names. But the heart of the project remained the same: listening, presence, and staying. All that they had learned together since that bench point one afternoon. A journalist came by asking to interview them. "You two are an example of a love that survived time," he said, impressed. Nathan smiled gently. "Love survives when we learn not to run," Alyssa added, holding his hand. "And when we understand that love also means staying when nothing shines." The interview was published, but they never read it. What mattered was already written in the story they had built with their own steps. Years passed slowly, and the world changed a lot outside. But inside their home, time seemed to slow down. They still had tea at night, read aloud, and walked barefoot on the porch, still laughed over silly things, and sat in the square without needing to speak. Their love had become solid ground. It didn't shake anymore. It was steady, like roots. Quiet, like peace. One morning, Nathan didn't come down for breakfast. Alyssa went upstairs and found him lying peacefully, with a soft smile on his lips. There was no pain, no fear, no goodbye. Only presence until the very end. She sat by the bed and held his hand for hours. No tears at first, just silence. The same silence with which everything had begun. The entire town came to a stop that day. Raises stood still. The children drew pictures for the warm coffee man, and volunteers left flowers on the square bench. Alyssa asked for nothing. She simply returned to the usual place and sat with the wind on her face. She knew he was still there. In every corner, every wall he had painted, every handwritten phrase. Nathan had become permanence that I in the days that followed. She kept on living. She suffered, of course, cried silently while sweeping the clinic or arranging mugs in the cupboard. But never alone. He was in her memories, in her choices, in everything she had learned. And more than anything, he was in how she had learned to love and to stay. She didn't need statues in his honor. She was his living memory. On Sundays, she'd go back to the square with just one mug, but sat on the same side of the bench. She'd close her eyes and whisper things never spoken aloud. She'd talk about the clinic, how the young ones were learning to listen, how the mothers smiled differently now. She knew he heard her, somehow, because Nathan never promised to be there. He just chose not to leave. And that never changed. Years later, a young journalist asked to write a book about the project. Alyssa agreed, on one condition: don't write about a great romance. Write about small gestures. The book was titled Roots That Remain. And in the dedication, Alyssa wrote, "To those who understand that love isn't about intensity. It's about presence that doesn't leave." Old age arrived gently. Alyssa walked more slowly, spoke more softly, but her gaze never lost its light. Every day, someone new came to Raises to say thank you. She listened with care, smiled, and replied, "I just heard what the world ignored." And when asked how it all began, she always gave a short answer: with a man who used to run and ended up staying. One evening, curled up in her favorite chair, with a blanket on her legs and her heart at ease, Alyssa felt her body rest completely. The sky outside was clear, and the silence inside her absolute. In that moment, there was no pain, no longing, only reunion. Because where love remains, there is no end. Only continuity in another form. And she knew. He was waiting on the bench. They say that same night, a different breeze swept through the town. Windows fluttered, trees whispered. And, on the square bench, two mugs were left side by side, steam still rising. No one saw who placed them, but everyone knew whose they were. The whole town understood. Their love had become eternal, not in monuments, but in the daily lives of those who had learned to listen. Raises continues to this day, with new faces and new stories. But the essence remains: to care, to listen, to stay. The walls have been restored, the rooms expanded. But the phrase on the main hallway wall was never removed. Love that remains is the kind that doesn't need to prove it stayed. And whoever walks in feels something different, even without knowing why. It's as if the place has a soul, and that it was watered by two hearts that didn't know how to leave the end of the garden, where wildflowers grow between old stones. A small plaque rests on the ground. There are no names or dates on it. Only, here began a silence that never ended. Those who read it feel it, because some stories don't need to be shouted. They echo, even without sound. Alyssa and Nathan's love didn't become a movie, nor did it go viral online. But it changed lives, and it still does. Because loving with presence is stronger than loving with promises. And to stay is the rarest way to say, I was here, and I chose not to leave. Every year, on the same date Nathan first appeared. In the square, someone leaves 2 mugs of hot coffee on the bench, and no one touches them. It's like a silent agreement in the town, a ritual of gratitude, a reminder that real love still exists, and that some silences last forever. Maybe the world will keep running. Maybe the loudest stories will continue, making headlines. But there, in Willow Spring, lived a love that didn't need to prove anything. It simply stayed. And in every forgotten mug, every calm gesture, every pause, they are still there. And they always will be. Asterisk if this story touched your heart. Leave a comment sharing what moved you the most. Tell us which city you're watching from. Like the video, share it with someone who needs to believe in love. And don't forget to subscribe. Every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, a new story that will make you feel. Because here, we tell stories that stay with you. See you next time.